I will introduce the two speakers first, and then we'll begin with the first paper. Professor Mello from the Department of Film, Radio and Television, University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and she's currently visiting fellow at King's College London. Cecilia has been involved with the previous intermediate projects here at the University of Reading, including the first edition of Intermediate into Arts Workshop, China and UK in Focus back in 2019, and the Intermediate Conference, the Moving Form of Film, back in 2017, where she and Dr. Corey Schultz had a discussion on Jia Zhangke's film. And she was also very active. She's also very active in other intercultural activities. One I personally found very interesting is in 2019, Taiwan Film Festival in Sao Paulo, and which Cecilia curated with Dr. Kelly Xie from Taiwan. So yeah, I missed that, but I'm looking forward. It looks like a very interesting program. Her latest publication is The Cinema of Jia Zhangke, Realism and Memory in Chinese Film, published in 2019.
But it's my great pleasure to be here today at the University of Reading. I'd like to start by thanking Lucia and Najib for the invitation to be here one more time. I've had the opportunity to present my research at this university before, as Xing just mentioned to you, and it's always a great pleasure to be here. And I'd also like to thank Mark Player and Xing for organizing this beautiful event and for the invitation and for having me today. So I will read my paper in the interest of time, and I had a bit of a hard time selecting a clip from the film. As you will see, and I'll be talking about this film, Long Day's Journey, tonight. It is composed of many long takes, and it ends with a 59 minutes long take in 3D. So it was really difficult for me to find a clip that would be less than 5 minutes. And I didn't really want to break Bi Gan's long takes to show you just a clip of a long take. So I've decided to give the talk and I prepared slides with lots of images, and I hope that towards the end I will be able to show you a 1 minute film that he made just before Long Day's Journey tonight, and that sort of encapsulates a lot of the points that I'm going to be making about the film. So it's quite interesting that you have a very long film with very long takes, and then you have a 1 minute film, but I hope that you'll find it interesting and sort of in some ways a shortcut to a Long Day's Journey into Night and the points I would be hoping to make today. So my talk will investigate Bi Gan's film Long Day's Journey into Night, in Chinese Di Chou Cai Hou Da Ye Wan, made in 2018, from the point of view of its at once realist and phantasmagorical aesthetics. As I would suggest, the film belongs to a larger trend in contemporary East and Southeast Asian cinemas and Latin American cinemas that incorporates elements of the magical and the phantasmagorical into an aesthetics of realism, displaying both a preoccupation with the index and an acute perception of the complexities of the cinematographic image's relationship with the objective real. So while relying on what is often understood as a Bazinian aesthetic realism based on deep focus and long takes on real locations and privileging a quotidian plot and narrative structure, these films transcend this realist impulse by including ghosts and fantastic beings, unexplainable events and atmospheres of fear into their diegesis. This paradoxical bond with reality encapsulates the real experience of fear in Latin American cities, marked by social violence, and the fears and tensions that emerge from unresolved political violence, both in Latin America and in East and Southeast Asian countries, past and present. As a result, films from these regions open themselves up to the intersection of different temporalities, the present of phenomenological reality, the layers of the past and the realm of memory that belong to the time of posthumous presences, and the strange occurrences that may belong to the future. This, I argue, is symptomatic of a particular historical moment marked by intense spatial transformation and by the consequent loss of reference and memory. Within a larger group of films that belong to this trend, I locate a smaller number of Asian films that openly reference Latin American artistic expressions, including the work of two of the most exciting and feted auteurs in recent decades. Here, the intermedial inter-arts approach assumes an intergeographical or intergeopolitical stance, allowing me to open up the limits of realism through a South-South comparative analysis. The films in question are Memoria by Apichatpong Weerasethakul, set and shot in Colombia, and Bi Gan's Long Day's Journey Tonight, the subject of my talk today. As I will argue, Bi Gan's film is exemplary of this trend and derives its complex structure from a fruitful intermediate relationship with literature, sharing narrative strategies and aesthetic resources of Latin American magical realism, as well as with China's classical novel The Story of the Stone, a hypothesis that unfortunately I won't be able to explore today. I won't have time. This combination of realism and the fantastic signals a mistrust in tandem with what Thomas Elsaesser has called post-epistemological ontology, and what I term phantasmagorical realism. As Lucia Najib and I have noted in the introduction to the book Realism and the Audiovisual Media, there has been a renewed interest in the notion of realism in film and audiovisual media theory after the introduction of digital technology from the 1990s onwards, in tandem with the return of the real in contemporary cinema production. Long Day's Journey Tonight, as well as Bi Gan's previous feature film Kylie Blues from 2016, can both be regarded as part of an international trend in cinematic realism that both recuperates and updates a Bazinian preoccupation with duration and with an extended notion of time, alongside the work of Tai Ming Liang, Carlos Egadas, Gus Van Sant, Apichatpong Weerasethakul, Bellatar, and many others, all champions of the long take so cherished by André Bazin. This often appears as a contradictory response to the so-called crisis of indexicality prompted by the introduction of digital technology, for contemporary realistic experiences are not only made in digital but also facilitated by its portability, sensitivity to light, ability to record very long takes, and affordability. This paradoxical nature of the realist response to the crisis of indexicality goes beyond the use of digital technology, since it is also possible to observe to different extents a dissociation from the objective real in a great number of realist experiences in contemporary cinema. In Realism of the Senses in World Cinema, Tiago De Luca explored the current aesthetic preference in contemporary cinema for the hyperbolic long take. By taking Bazin's foundational theory as a starting point, De Luca demonstrates how it is being reshaped by a sensorial mode of address based on a prolonged inspection of physical reality, which goes well beyond the demands of dramaturgy. Gus Van Sant, for instance, builds his Death trilogy from a series of long takes, but he frequently complicates the focus on the real by employing experimental strategies that evoke, through the form of film, altered mental states. Another crucial contribution to this debate is that of Thomas Elsaesser, who, in World Cinema Realism, Evidence, Presence, suggests that realism is a defining element of world cinema of all times, a tendency that is becoming, however, increasingly infused with fantasy and magic, bringing into question terms such as evidence, authenticity, and spectatorial presence. Elsaesser locates this aesthetics of world cinema in what is a global context rather than in a national or regional cinema. He refers to a generation of filmmakers across the world who work with digital technology by choice as much as by necessity, and whose films, I quote, manifest the inherent specifics of digital media, as well as thematize the challenges to photographic realism, end of quote. While this trend is noticeable in cinemas around the world, I locate in East and Southeast Asia the manifestation of a phantasmagorical realism as a specific aspect of Elsaesser's post-epistemological ontology. The work of Apichatpong Weerasethakul in Thailand and Tai Ming Liang in Taiwan are examples of this trend, as they are anchored in a Bazinian realist aesthetic, but often transcend this impulse by including ghosts and fantastic beings into their diegeses. This haunted realism, or phantasmagorical realism, and here haunted realism, I'm using the term by Chris Berry. He applied this to the work of Taiwanese filmmaker Chen Tzu-chi. So this phantasmagorical realism can also be understood in terms of its relationship with Asian religion traditions such as Buddhism, Taoism, Animism, and Shintoism, which complicate the moving image's ties with reality. At the same time, recent Latin American films such as Neighboring Sounds, History of Fear, Hard Labor, The Great Movement, as well as Chinese films such as Shadow Days and The Wild Goose Lake, as well as Bi Gan's aforementioned features, combine a realist impulse with certain conventions of crime drama, film noir, and the horror genre, and include fantastic and ghostly elements in their narratives. The neo-noir style of these films, packed with neon lights, nostalgic songs, retro haircuts, alluring poses, mysterious women, and broken clock motifs, inevitably brings to mind the work of Wong Kar-wai in Hong Kong, as well as sixth-generation films by Wang Xiaoshuai and Lo Ye. Furthering the intermediate inter-arts, intergeographical, intergeopolitical approach, I would suggest exploring the connections between a post-epistemological ontology in contemporary Chinese cinema and the magical realism of Latin American literature through the works of Bi Gan. In an excellent article called Between Ontology and Hauntology, Magic Realism in Contemporary Chinese Cinema from 2020, Mei Gao evokes the appearance of young filmmakers in mainland China, such as Bi Gan, Yan Chao, and Tai Chongjie, and notes how they brought alternative representations of reality through an aesthetic practice that can be described as an instance of magical realism, and I quote, "By materializing ghosts, engaging with the spectral, and complicating received notions of time, space, and identity, the films adopt and reinterpret conventions of magical realism to explore personal, spiritual, and social realities." End of quote. Mei Gao critically assesses the theoretical approximation of magical realism in literature and cinema to Jacques Derrida's neologism ontology. The ontology's manifestation of a visible and invisible trace of the past that haunts the present. To this end, she analyzes two representative works, The Widowed Witch by Tai Chongjie and Bi Gan's Kylie Blues. The first understood as in dialogue with the tradition of critical realism in Chinese cinema in its use of magical elements for the construction of a social allegory and a discursive space for the subaltern, and the second as incorporating magical realism into the cinematographic form, employing it as a representational strategy for spiritual realities, cosmic connections, and spectral presences that haunt the living present. Mei Gao further notes how magical realism provides an opportunity for stylistic innovation and for the articulation of the spectral, the subaltern, and the intangible in the context of Chinese independent cinema, where realism is still dominant. Not by chance, directors Tai Chongjie and Bi Gan, as well as renowned authors such as the Nobel Prize winner Mo Yan and writer Chen Dongxi, cite the importance of magical realism in Latin American literature of the 20th century in their conceptions of the genre, reinforcing the connection between East, Southeast Asia, and Latin America from the point of view of their disparate and yet obliquely analogous recent historical experiences. At a political moment when violence, division, and oppression are on the rise, and when the importance of memory in many countries in both regions is still ignored, cinema has been capturing, imagining, and projecting contested spaces, repressed voices, and unsaid complexities, bringing the past forward by conjuring up its ghosts and their stories. So on to the film now. Bi Gan's second feature, Long Day's Journey into Night, from 2018, expands on some of the themes and language experiments in his first feature film, proposed in his first feature film, Kylie Blues, and embraces magical realism in its aesthetics, narrative, and subject matter. Bi Gan is a young film director and poet born in 1989 in Guizhou province in southern China, in Kylie, a county-level city under the administration of Qiandong Miao and Dong Autonomous Prefecture. He made 4 short films from 2010 onwards before premiering his first feature, Kylie Blues, at the 2015 Locarno Film Festival, where he won the award for Best Emerging Director. The film, whose Chinese title, Lu Bian Yezan, meaning Road Picnic, is borrowed from the 1971 Strugatsky brothers' philosophical science fiction novel, which was adapted by Tarkovsky in Stalker, blurs the boundaries between past, present, and future, and between fantasy and reality, decisively inaugurating his cinematographic style within the tradition of magical realism. Shot on location in the director's hometown with amateur actors and spoken in the local dialect, Kylie Blues features an impressive 41-minute long take in which the main character enters a mysterious village called Danmai in search of his missing son. In 2018, Bi Gan releases his second feature film, Long Day's Journey into Night, at the Cannes Film Festival Un Certain Regard section, and expands on several of the themes previously covered in Kylie Blues, including a journey through Danmai, the mysterious village where the past, the present, and the future coexist. The film deals with the story of Luo Hongwu, who returns to his hometown of Kylie after a long absence in search of the woman he loved and never managed to forget. Among the numerous references cited by Bi Gan in the making of the film, one can especially note his fascination with Chagall and the painting The Promenade from 1918, directly referenced in one of the film's posters, the literature and art of memory of Jean-Patrick Modiano, the poem Poppy and Memory by Paul Celan, Dante's Divine Comedy, and the cinema of Wong Kar-wai, and also Jia Zhangke and Tsai Ming-liang, although he doesn't really address these two filmmakers much, but it's quite obviously there as well. And the title of the film in English refers to the eponymous play by Eugene O'Neill, written in the 1940s. But more importantly, the title of the film in Chinese, Di Chou Cui Hou De Ye Wan, literally Last Evenings on Earth, brings us to Latin America, in a direct reference to the eponymous short story by Chilean writer Roberto Bolaño. The long list of references cited in several interviews by the director also includes quite prominently the novel Pedro Páramo by Mexican writer Juan Rulfo, published in 1955 and considered the most important precursor of Latin American magical realism. The film consists of 2 parts, the first in 2D and the second made up of a 59-minute long take in 3D. In the first part, the chronological narrative is constantly interrupted by the emergence of memory, which confuses filmic linearity and introduces a fantastic or haunted dimension to the diegesis. In the second part, the long take transmutes into a 3D amalgam capable of containing at once multiple temporalities and spatialities. The confluence of temporalities and spatialities in the film refutes the spatial paradigms put forward by from the late 1960s onwards, by structuralist semiotic and psychoanalytical theory. Since the early 90s, these paradigms have undergone several revisions in which the idea of cinema as a direct heir of Renaissance perspective has been rejected. Elsaesser, for instance, relates the present ontological turn in cinema to a renunciation of the mode of visual representation based on the central monocular perspective. Other revisions can be found in David Bordwell's call for a cognitivist understanding of perspective, the rejection by Jonathan Crary of the idea of a single objective position of knowledge, and Giuliana Bruno's proposition of cinema as a spatial art, moving the focus from sight, look to sight, place. In this process of revision, filmic space also began to be appreciated from the point of view of a haptic experience and of movement. If the very notion of space in contemporary visual culture tends towards fluidity, it is remarkable how a considerable number of cinematographic experiences in Latin America and Southeast Asia, while emerging from places in transition, call into question the indexical property of the cinematographic image, which begins to suffer from an epistemological mistrust. The loss of monocular perspective, the transformation of space, and the disappearance of memory, while bringing to light a desire to preserve the real, also seem to suggest that it is no longer possible to trust what one sees. Epistemological distrust manifests itself in Long Day's Journey to Night, first and foremost, through a labyrinthine sense of space and a non-linear narrative time. Christian Borges has employed the art of the labyrinth to the study of the cinema of Jean-Marie Straub, whose camera movements, chronicled by Anna Madalena Bach, establish imaginary corridors that open and close to the sound of music. Borges makes an important reference to literature in his chapter on the art of the labyrinth, and evokes Jorge Luis Borges' short story, The Garden of Forking Paths. The story of the tale takes the form of a statement signed by a Chinese-English teacher named Dr. Yu Tsun, who lived in the UK during World War I. Yu Tsun's grandfather, Cui Pan, had been a governor at Yunnan province in southern China, who had abandoned his profession and renounced temporal power to engage in creating a labyrinth and writing a novel. After 13 years of effort, Cui Pan is murdered by a stranger, leaving behind only chaotic manuscripts and a labyrinth that no one could find. At the end of the story, the unraveling of the mystery of Cui Pan reveals a labyrinth of time, the garden of paths, where different futures proliferate and bifurcate. Borges' tale, much more complex than this brief mention suggests, and which may have foreshadowed the interpretation of the multiple worlds of quantum mechanics and hypertext fiction, serves as a poetic substrate for Christian Borges, who suggests that Straub, by adopting long takes in the form of corridors or galleries, distorts the role of montage, making it more eccentric and complex. If Jorge Luis Borges' tale presents an incomplete image based on the universe conceived by Cui Pan, which differs from the Newtonian conception of a uniform and absolute time by embracing infinite time series and a growing number of dizzying network of divergent times, convergent and parallel. Something similar seemed to happen in Bi Gan's film, equally composed of long and hyperbolic long takes where multiple temporal layers intertwine without apparent distinction. Unlike a narrative or discursive montage, the film presents an internal, dreamlike, magical montage which incorporates the time of the dead and those who have disappeared, complicating the understanding of the Bazinian long take as a guarantor of spatial-temporal integrity. The first part of the film, shot in 2D, is entirely constructed from displacements in moving vehicles, dirt roads and railways that suggest the multiple bifurcations and temporalities at play. Extending Jorge Luis Borges' discussion to include space and invoking once again the importance of the labyrinth as a constituent element of the image and filmic construction, the use of spaces in ruins, semi-destroyed and flooded buildings, deep corridors, tunnels and potholed walls seem to act in the film as portals to other spaces and times. So there are some images here and here as well. And finally here. The transition to the 3D long take happens after 1 hour and 11 minutes of projection and is anticipated by the character's entry into a ruined cinema and by the appearance of the film's title. The same cinema, the heterotopic space par excellence in the Foucaultian sense of the term, had already featured in the film in two memory images. In the first, Luo and his girlfriend were seen watching a film. And as you can see, the mise-en-scène in Bi Gan's film is reminiscent of Tai Ming Liang's short film and museum installation, It's a Dream, from 2007. In the second image, memory image, the cinema was displayed upside down. Finally, now we see Luo sitting in the cinema and he puts on his 3D glasses, thus assuming a position of a spectator of his own journey, which will begin in an abandoned mine and last 59 minutes. The 3D long take, which is a truly technical and aesthetic tour de force, relates not only to the confluence of distinct temporalities and spatialities established in the first part of the film, but also, and quite decisively, to new dimensions of audiovisual media in our time, based on its haptic qualities, virtual realities, and 360-degree images, and supported by the proliferation of smartphones and other screens that allow and invite touch and manipulation, complicating the optical paradigm. As Elsaesser points out, and I quote, "The idea of a digital photo as a window to a view, to contemplate or to be a witness to, has been replaced by the notion of an image as a passage or a portal, an interface or part of a sequential process, in short, as a cue for action." End of quote. The creative exploration of 3D, anticipated by the hyperbolic use of the dream sequence in the work of Bi Gan and other directors attuned to the phantasmagorical realism, such as Apichapong Verasutakul, appears in recent documentaries such as The Cave of Forgotten Dreams and Pina, who take advantage of the depth and curvature of the image to aesthetically explore prehistoric paintings and the art of dance. In Long Day's Journey into Night, Bi Gan explores the aesthetic possibilities of 3D imaging beyond its function as an attraction. Rather, he introduces what Elsaesser called, and I quote, "the malleability, scalability, fluidity, or curvature of digital images into audiovisual space, doing away with horizons, suspending vanishing points, seamlessly varying distance, unchaining the camera and transporting the observer." End of quote. In short, the use of the 3D as well as the mise-en-scène choices in the first part of the film open up the possibilities of the spatial-temporal continuum of the long take and welcomes into it phantasmagorical presences that allow, and I quote, "history to commingle with the present," in Avery Gordon's terms. His ghosts seem to hide lingering social narratives, resisting as political entities within China's contested present. These are my references, and I will now like to show you a 1-minute film by Bi Gan. And before I do, because the film doesn't have subtitles, I translated it, and Sheen told me the translation is okay. So it starts, I'll just read it to you, it's a poem. Okay, the first dialogue doesn't have any subtitles in Chinese, but they're just talking about playing ping pong. But I'll read the poem and then we'll see the film. So, rain showers the dream, unclosed window, a search on the wind. It's me writing a letter sent to amniotic fluid mentioned in the letter. The universe calls it ash, we call it earth. It also says you can't ride the wind, but stones can float. And you don't forget that with your little cry you greet me.
大就大了么茶，你还有意思？
大球打么个垃圾，篮球盘。
雨给梦冲凉，没关窗户，研究风。我呀，在写信，寄给杨水，信里提到宇宙称呼它为灰， 我们叫地球，还提到风车不能骑，但是四周可以打水漂。你呀，到时别忘了用小小的哭声款待我。
So what I should have said before, and I apologize for not saying it, is the title of the film is Secret Goldfish. It was made in 2016. It was made for the Golden Horse Film Festival in Taiwan, in Taipei, and it was shot on 16mm. And the reason I showed the film is that it illustrates this idea of the long take working as a portal from one space into another space, and traversing different spaces and passing through holes and taking us somewhere else. So an image that transforms itself into another, and alluding then to the fluidity and to this idea of a malleability and fluidity and scalability that Elsaesser links to the 3D and to also world cinema realism. So thank you very much. Questions from the audience? Alistair?
Thank you very much indeed for that, Cecilia. And you raised so many really important things. I wonder whether you could just talk a little bit. You made me think about I'm thinking about Elsaesser's vocabulary and your vocabulary in terms of textual analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about maybe 3 modes or forms where we can think about passage or transition that you identify in relation to the long take. One might be a long passage where the camera is moving, like we see in that instance you've just shown, where there is a suggestion or a kind of more haptic version of visualization of a portal. Another might be where the movement is occurring within the image but the camera itself is static.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course the third is the cut, which we also see. And I wonder whether you want to speak about those 3 and whether you think they articulate different things, or whether Gan as a filmmaker is working through those different articulations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Alistair, for the question. I think in Bi Gan, even from Kylie Blues, he's very interested in these types of long takes that take the form of a tour de force. So it will be rehearsed and it will be moving and it will be calling attention to this spectacle of a moving camera traversing a space, and but he of course in both films he does transition between these 3 modes that you just brilliantly pointed out. So of course there are cuts, and he will use editing, and he will cut, and then he will have long takes which are more static, and then especially in Long Day's Journey Tonight it will sort of move towards this final long take, 59 minutes in 3D, the longest long take in the history of cinema in 3D, etc. So there's a progression. So this camera becomes more and more like a traveling camera through space, but a space that becomes something else constantly without cutting. So I see a progression in this film in particular, whereby it assumes more and more and more this magical quality. The camera itself has a magical quality of unveiling space, but taking us from one space into another space in the mode of like something that you would touch, a touch screen. So you would make it bigger, make it smaller. You would flick through images. Or a video game where you just travel and becomes something else. So all of these new technologies, that lead to new definitions of images, of the image and of audiovisual media as well, that Elsaesser is alluding to, are very explicit in Bi Gan's interest in space. So he's a filmmaker that he's filming in ruins, and ruins have been a trope. The trope of ruins is very sort of prominent in contemporary Chinese cinema, and it alludes to spatial instability, transformation, and we have similar tropes that appear in Latin American cinema as well. Of course, I'm making broad generalizations here, but these are, as I've been suggesting, geopolitical regions that have seen intense spatial transformation in the not so distant past. So cinema looks at that transformation, and that's very much a feature, for instance, of Jajanka's cinema and other filmmakers. But Bi Gan, he films in ruins as well, but he complicates this relationship between, that's what I've been trying to suggest, between his camera and the real, by he's still on location, and there's still, the film is shot in real locations, real ruins, real buildings, but the way his camera moves promotes this sort of almost like a magical transformation of one space into another.
It would be good for us to intersperse in-person questions with questions from the remote audience. I think there is...
We don't have someone's comment, Valerie has commented, really enjoyed the presentation, looking forward to hearing more about the connection Cecilia mentioned. So I don't know if what you've just sort of said now, maybe that sort of speaks to more of those connections, but yeah, so.
Okay, so may I offer some questions myself, because I'm dying to ask questions. It was a sensational talk, and gave me so many ideas, and also brought in some enigmas to be unveiled. Why Latin America and East Asia and Southeast Asia? Where does this connection come from? And I was thinking that at the beginning you mentioned the role of religions such as Buddhism, Taoism, blah blah, in Asia. And I was thinking, because your examples also brought to my mind the example of Ciro Guerra and Cristina Gallego, such as Birds of Passage, which is entirely shot on location with non-professional actors, blah blah, and suddenly there is a bird, and the birds are real, the birds are there, and those birds are also harbingers of death and of disgrace and all the rest of it. So there's a whole symbology, and this is connected with the particular indigenous population of that part of Colombia. And so there's, and obviously you would see that in all the magical realist literature that you see in Latin America, connected with local traditions, but also with the syncretism of local beliefs and imported religions from the colonialists. So it's incredibly complex. So my question is, where does this connection come from? Is it political? Is it religious in their approximation? And is it really something particular, or you could be making the same case for Europe, for the United States? Cecilia Sayad just launched the book about horror realism that includes films from the United States. So my question is more this kind of regional connection, whether there is something absolutely particular and specific to them, or whether it's something that you could really, a model that you could apply to other cultures.
Thank you so much, Lucia. That's an excellent question. And of course, this is part of a bigger research project that I have been working on, but on and off, and I'm here now trying to kind of really further it. And it is difficult to reply to your question and be very positive about this connection being very exclusive to these two regions. However, I do see that there are, and what I've tried to establish is that there are connections, geopolitical and geographic and historical connections between these two regions that are not direct connections, but analogous experiences in these regions that seem to be so different, but actually, if we look at recent past and political trauma, we will see that these, experiences are not that dissimilar, and that observation, which tries to bring a different approach, so a south-south approach, thinking of the global south and all of that. So this observation is corroborated by, for instance, the work of Bi Gan or Moyen or other writers who openly say how Latin American magical realism was incredibly important to them. So that makes me wonder why. And of course, the easy answer to this question is that through magical realism, you find ways of saying those things that you can't say in any other way, or you will be able to address a reality that cannot be addressed directly, be it because of censorship, because of political oppression, because it's so traumatic that you can't really get to it directly. So you need to find other ways. Also, there are, of course, the religious traditions of, Asia and indigenous populations in Latin America that are quite, analogous in many, many different ways. So this is something else to explore, and it's a lot to explore. And I don't suppose I will be able to explore it on my own, because you would have to find, there are many, ways of approaching this. So. Perspectivism, the Eduardo Vieira de Castro, or this a new understanding of the indigenous culture in Latin America could also come to the service of this project, or come to help me in this project. So there's a lot of things that I can, that come to mind, and I've been trying to think about all these things. Also, magical realism in literature is not realism in film. Realism in film is different, but what are the connections here? And so it's I have more questions than answers to this, but I do think
the magic of new technology.
And the magic of new technology. But I do think, just to finish, that you can't apply it, for instance, to the United States, or you can't apply it to Europe. I think the case I'm trying to make is that it is peculiar to these regions because of this analogous experiences of spatial transformation, changing cities, a disregard for memory that you see in Latin America and in East Asia and Southeast Asia, political trauma, and all of these things approximate these regions and distantiate them from Europe and the United States. You see, so I really do think that there's something that there's a connection there.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, question here.
Thank you. I really enjoy your paper. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Since you just mentioned the Moyen and other Chinese writers, I just want to add a few comments, maybe to contribute to this discussion.
Thank you.
Why magical realism was so well received in 1980s China? It is because this is the first time to Chinese writers, the writers from third world, they could produce some modernist literature. It is very different from European modernism, high modernism. So if I link that back to Bi Gan, maybe this drive, this desire for international recognition may also play a part. Maybe Bi Gan wants to create a kind of like art film, right? So this shifted the paradigm. So we are really not talking about a realist film, we're talking about different kind of a type. So it's just like a few thoughts.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I mean, absolutely fascinating that these connections that they because I've been reconnecting with I'm Brazilian, but I've been reconnecting with Latin American literature through China, through my research on Chinese film. You see,
also
so
Latin American literature talk about the countryside, not the city, not
exactly.
the experience. So that was very fascinating.
Fascinating as well. Thank you. We'll definitely talk more about it. Well,
I think we need to bring this to a close now and make room for the next speaker. Is that?
Yeah, we might have time for one more quick question.
Okay.
Just a quick thing. If anyone had anything quick to say.
I just wanted to sort of reiterate that idea in relation to cinema, and there's a kind of maybe a particular instantiation of cinematic modernism going back to the moment of Tarkovsky. And you could historicise how his work was received in both regions, maybe fruitfully.
that's really important. I think Tarkovsky is kind of like a key in there as well.
And I think
Sort of making
there are different
Yeah.
Tarkovskys in different parts of the world.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And I was fascinated by the sound design of the short film. The ping pong produced by a human sound and the water that's natural.
Mm-hmm.
Ping, ping, ping. Did you see that one transited to
Yes,
the next?
yeah.
So we are always very fascinated with the imagery, but the sound is amazing, and the sound has a very important role in creating atmosphere and supernatural atmosphere as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.